Hello everybody, welcome to Deluxe Collectibles, and today I'm going to be discussing whether or not I think it's a good idea for Ninjago to bring back original villains for new seasons, and whether it's a villainous role or a heroic role in the future. So I'm going to touch on each of the villains that we've seen, the main sort of antagonists for each season of Ninjago, and we'll be going in order from the pilot all the way to the point that we're at now in Seabound. So without further ado, let's get straight into it here. And the first villain, of course, is going to be Samukai here, and this character, I really don't think it's necessary for him to return at any point in the future for Ninjago, because of course we did get to see him return in a smaller role for Day of the Departed. Of course, we got to see multiple villains return for that special. I don't think people really love that special, so they don't really look upon it too fondly, but I don't think it's very necessary. The skeletons are what I would kind of consider to be a bit of one-dimensional characters, so unless they could really turn it around and show us more sides to this character, then I don't really think it's too necessary to bring them back. Then the next one here is Pythor, and this is a character who of course we did get to see return in season 3 and then assisting the Overlord, so I don't really think it's too necessary to see him once again in the series. I don't really feel like that would really add to the story in any sort of way, and I feel like we've explored a lot about Pythor at this point, so I definitely don't think that in a main sort of role that we would really need to see him ever again or have him return in any sort of sense. Then we have Garmadon, who of course is a huge character for the Ninjago franchise, so of course I would definitely love to see him return at some point in the future, and I think it is likely that we would see him once again, whether it's on a role of being an antagonist, or more than likely I would say kind of helping out the ninja with kind of how he's turned around, of course, after the last time we saw him. So I definitely do think this is more likely than not for us to see him once again in the series, so I would definitely look forward to that quite a bit. Then the next one is the Overlord, and of course we did get to see him heavily featured, of course, in Season 2 of Ninjago and in Season 3 as well, and he is a very big villain, of course, for Ninjago, and I know there are quite a few people who definitely would like to see him kind of almost be the final sort of villain for Ninjago, because he's just such a big villain and arguably caused us one of the biggest loss in Ninjago, of course, Zane. Now, of course, that was very temporary as he returned in the next season that followed, but I do think that he is an intriguing villain, but I don't know if he has the greatest motivation. He always just kind of comes off as just evil for the sake of being evil. There aren't really any reasons that I can kind of empathize with or kind of at least understand his perspective, so I don't think it's as necessary of a return here, but I definitely wouldn't be opposed to it. Honestly, with any of these characters, I wouldn't be opposed to them returning, so it's just kind of my personal opinion and sort of my thoughts on whether or not it would work at any point in the future if they did return. Now we have Chen, who I really don't think there's too much of a high possibility of him returning at any point. Now I do think that he could maybe be referenced in the series, or that we could kind of see him in flashbacks, because I do think that Skylar is going to wind up being a bigger part of the show in 2022, so it would definitely make sense if we explored some of her past, and I think that Chen, of course, could obviously wind up appearing in some of those flashbacks and explanations to kind of give us more depth for her character. So no, I don't think in a main sort of role in the present time, but I definitely think in flashbacks there is a high possibility of him returning. Next up here is Morro, and I do think that Morro would be a really cool character to wind up seeing. Now, of course, he is basically dead in the series, I would say, considering his demise at the end of Possession, so I don't really think that he's a character that we would end up seeing, at least in like some sort of like present day sense. Maybe once again a character who we could see in the past for some sort of reason, but I don't really know if it's too likely. I think that they kind of closed off his story in a satisfying way, so I don't really think I'd want to see him return in the future at some point, but still, he is a cool character, so I guess if they could find a way to work him in, then I suppose it could wind up working out well. Now we've got a big villain who I think people would really love to see return to Ninjago, and this is Nadakhan, of course, and I think it would be really cool to see this character return. Of course, we've been teased quite a bit with seeing the teapot of Tyran with clutch powers quite often, so I think they're kind of teasing it in the background. Whether or not it's an Easter egg or not is kind of up to question or personal opinion, really. I think that they're definitely trying to tease us, and then we could see him maybe tied in to like the Vengestone buyer. I think that could definitely be a possibility, so I would like to see him return for sure. I think he's a really compelling character, and I think there's a lot that you can do with him as well, and I think that he definitely posed like one of the highest threats to Ninjago. I mean, they literally kind of had to just retcon the season in order to be able to defeat him, so he definitely raises quite a high threat, so I think he would work out really well for the actual like newer season, so I would definitely like to see him return at some point. Then we have Sensei Yang, who I don't really think is necessary to have return. I think we got to close off his story pretty well in Day of the Departed, and I don't really think people look too fondly, as I'd said earlier, upon that special, so I don't really think it's necessary to have him return at any point in the future. Alright, now we've got the Time Twins here, of course, Crux and Acronix, who we did recently get to technically see return in one of the reimagined shorts, of course, going up against Wu, but in the present day sense, I definitely think that there is a lot of potential for them to return, and I talked about this in some of my reimagined shorts videos, and I spoke about how I think that they intentionally kind of left it open-ended as to what kind of wound up happening to them. Of course, we're meant to assume that they just wound up getting lost in time, but of course, that doesn't mean that we couldn't wind up seeing them again. Of course, Wu wound up getting to come back, he turned into a baby, and then we wound up getting to see him once again in the series, so I definitely don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities, and they are once again really cool characters with really great abilities. I love seeing series and movies kind of play around with time travel, so I definitely think it could be cool to see them come back at some point in the series, so definitely something I would really look forward to. Harumi is the next villain here, and I don't think that there's really a high possibility or necessity for her to return in the series. I really loved when they put her in Prime Empire. I think that was like the perfect closure for her character and Lloyd as well with his relationship with her, so I honestly think they've kind of closed that off really well with her character, and I feel that it was kind of like almost like the fate that she wound up facing in season 9, I think was kind of like a good way to sort of send off her character. I think it really wrapped up her story very nicely, and I thought that she was such a great character, and I know I've heard people discuss kind of having her come back as maybe like a member of the ninja team or like working together with them in some sort of sense, but I think we kind of already got a taste of that. Even though she was deceiving them, she was still technically working together with the team, so I don't think it's too necessary, and I think they gave her character some really great closure. Now we've got the Iron Baron, who I'm just gonna say I don't think he's going to wind up returning at any point in the future. He was a cool villain, don't get me wrong, but I don't think he was the most compelling character, and I don't really think he would be a necessary one to kind of bring back in any sort of way, so definitely not one that I think has a high possibility. Now we've got the Omega, and just kind of as a whole, the Oni, I would say. Of course, I think that they did have a pretty decent role, of course, within March of the Oni. I think that, of course, that kind of being a very small sort of special, you could almost consider it to be. I think that you could kind of expand upon the Oni, of course. I think that would be interesting to kind of dive into that in a future storyline, and maybe some sort of other sense as well. Not necessarily having to follow the Omega, but maybe in some sort of other way. I think that we could tie that back in. So I definitely don't think, once again, that's kind of out of the realm of possibilities, and I would like to see it maybe in the future. So I definitely think that would be interesting, and also kind of tie into Garmadon as well, and Lloyd, of course. So if they want to explore that, I'd definitely be open to it. Now for the next two, I'm going to tackle them together here, and it's Aspheera and the Ice Emperor, and I don't think that there's going to be a high possibility of the Ice Emperor returning at any point. Of course, with Zane being the Ice Emperor, I don't really think that's very likely. And then Aspheera, I don't really think it's very highly looked upon, at least season 11, even as a whole, but I think specifically the Fire chapter. I think she is an interesting character, especially with her past relationship with Wu, of course, kind of that dynamic between the two of them, and even Garmadon as well. So it could be interesting, but I really don't think it's too likely for, of course, either of these characters. Now we've got Unigami here, and this is another character where I definitely don't think we'll wind up seeing them. I mean, we've technically seen the character again, even at the end of Seabound, we wind up seeing them in the crowd of people there, so I don't think that he'll ever return as an actual villain. I think that that kind of storyline was wrapped up really well at the end of Prime Empire, so not one that I think is very likely at all. Now for the Skull Sorcerer here, and I think this character was so cool, definitely one of my favorite villains from Ninjago, and I love Master of the Mountain so much, but it's not really a character that I think has to return. Now maybe Vangelis could return. I know that he is the Skull Sorcerer, so they're technically one and the same, but kind of just as himself. Maybe we could see him in the future, maybe the ninja when they're trying to investigate, I'm assuming at some point in 2022, the Vengestone buyer, maybe they can try to get more information from Vangelis than they would have already been able to get, because of course we know he was kind of tied in with that, so I think that there could be potential for that, but not as a primary villain for a new season. Now the final two here, I'm going to kind of combine these two together as well, because I kind of considered them to be sort of very closely connected, and that is Chief Mammatus is the first one, and then Kalmaar as well. Of course, Chief Mammatus didn't really turn out to be an actual villain. He was more of like an antagonist for the island, but then of course wound up being an ally to the ninjas, so I don't think that we'll see him ever in an antagonist role, but I definitely would be open to them returning to the island at some point in the future if it is necessary for some reason, maybe if they're trying to investigate how to be able to bring Nia back at some point, so I think they could tie it in that sort of way. And then for Kalmaar, I know there are a ton of theories, and this is one of the main reasons I did this video, of that Kalmaar kind of having the same sort of return as Pythor, of course with him facing a very, very similar demise as Pythor did with the Great Devourer, except of course with Kalmaar facing that with Wojira. So I mean, maybe we could see Kalmaar come back. I don't know if I necessarily like to see them kind of retread the same sort of return like that, unless it had a really good reason for it. I don't know if that would work as well. I love Kalmaar as a villain, but I think he kind of served his purpose within Seabound. But don't get me wrong, once again, with all of these villains, I am open to it if there's a good enough storyline. Of course, I'm not a writer for Ninjago, so if they could come up with a great idea for it to tie back in, then I'd be open to it, but I don't really think it's very likely, and I don't think they'd kind of retread the same sort of storyline like that again. Alright, so that's going to conclude my thoughts here on whether or not I think Ninjago should have original villains return for newer seasons. I definitely think, of course, from the video you can tell that I think for some cases it could definitely work really well for specific villains, but then for others I don't really think there's as high of a chance of that happening at some point in the future. So let me know your thoughts though down below. I'm really curious to hear what villains you think are most likely or least likely to return at any point in the future, and which ones do you want to see the most? Just taking aside or putting aside everything, like just facts wise and everything, like do you want to see some of these characters back? Even some of the ones that I said are less likely, feel free to let me know down below, because of course it's just my opinion and I completely want to hear yours as well in the comments. We can start a discussion about this because I think it's a really interesting topic, but I'll wrap it up here. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you did enjoy, be sure to leave a like and also subscribe as well. So thank you so much. I will see you all next time, and always remember, keep on collecting.